Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. We look at our political and cultural divide today and think that it can't get much worse. What we forget is that it has been worse. Not just when policy matters were settled by a duel or literally pitted brother against brother, but even in the 1960s and 1970s, students were shot at Kent State. Law enforcement was murdered in politically motivated robberies, and even the bombing of the U.S. Capitol was part of our contemporary political history and division. A powerful example of this is a group of left-wing women, fresh from their time in the Weather Underground, who got together in the early 1980s and the first blush of the Reagan years to become essentially domestic terrorists, bent on opposing the political, corporate, and government ideologies of the time. My guest, William Rosnaugh, takes us back to that time in his recent book, Tonight We Bombed the U.S. Capitol. William Rosnaugh is a senior research scientist at CNA, a nonprofit research and analysis organization, and a fellow in international security at New America. It is my pleasure to welcome William Rosnaugh here to talk about America's first female terrorist group and a really violent time in the U.S. William Rosnaugh, thanks so much for joining us.
Jeff, thanks very much. It's great being here.
One of the things that one has to understand, I think, first about this story is the context of the time, the amount of violence that was going on at the time, the bombings that were taking place, things that if any one of them happened today, it would be an international incident.
Absolutely. In fact, I was watching a Frontline two-parter on the political divide in the United States, the election of Trump, and there was this endless discussion by these various talking heads and journalists about how today America has never been more divided, which to me is absolutely laughable. I mean, you can talk about the 1850s and the run-up to the Civil War, things were quite a bit more divided, and you can talk about the 1960s and into the 1970s, where, as you said, I mean, there was an incredible level of political violence. There were, in the early 1970s, there were literally hundreds and hundreds of bombings in the United States a year. So, yes, we have our divisions today, certainly, but I don't think anything comparable to what was going on in these earlier periods in American history.
I mean, there were the bombings that we're talking about, but also political assassination, police officers, law enforcement being shot at and killed, robberies that were taking place that killed law enforcement. I mean, it was a really violent period.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the groups that I talk about in my book, the Black Liberation Army, which was an outgrowth of the Black Panther Party, they made it their mission to assassinate cops, mostly in New York, but also in the Bay Area, in other parts of the country, and they would literally go up to policemen sitting in their cars and shoot them in the head, or lure them into housing projects and assassinate them. And it's absolutely remarkable. And as you said, yeah, if that happened today, it would be almost unimaginable. And hopefully, we're not going to see that again. But okay, that's very, very different from, Antifa or, people breaking windows at demonstrations that we see today.
What was the psychological impact of all of this? Because it really goes to the very heart of whether or not this was terrorism at the time. Because terrorism, it seems, has a very specific goal in terms of its fear factor and psychological impact. There was so much violence at the time, one wonders if it was even terrorism, if it might be called something else.
I mean, terrorism specialists, there's a cottage industry of coming up with definitions of terrorism. And according to one estimate by a scholar named Alex Schmidt, there's something like 125 different definitions of terrorism in the academic literature, and every sort of scholarly or sort of policy-oriented study about terrorism usually begins with the question of definitions. What is terrorism? So it's an elusive concept. It's a contested concept, but there are plenty of contested concepts. I mean, what's democracy, what's pornography. But, for me, in essence, terrorism is the, purposeful use of violence or the threat of violence to further political, social, ideological agendas, intended to provoke fear and anxiety among a wider population, and to really try to cause that population to doubt the ability of the state to protect people. So it's really the psychological dimension, as you said, the psychological dimension of terrorism is absolutely paramount. It's not the individual act, which in most cases, 9/11 aside, or the Oklahoma City bombing, aren't that incredibly destructive, but it's the knock-on effect. It's the fear. It's the popular fear. It's the anxiety that terrorists seek to provoke, and some are able to do it.
It's interesting that so many of these groups, and M19, the May 19th group, this group of women that you talk about, and Tonight We Bombed the U.S. Capitol, had a kind of social justice basis for whatever it was that they were doing.
Yeah, I guess you could call it social justice. They were, most of them had been, or almost all of them had been, activists in the 1960s. Most of them had been involved with Students for a Democratic Society, and then later the Weather Underground, which broke up in the mid-70s. And in some ways, May 19th is, I think, continuation of the Weather Underground. But these people were, I would say, they were pretty committed Marxist-Leninists and anti-imperialists. So social justice was part of it. They were certainly supporters of gay liberation, human rights, stuff like that, kind of more social justice things. But they also had a pretty well-defined, it's actually pretty opaque if you try to take it apart, but they were quite ideological and part of this global struggle against imperialism in a supporting role. So in their view, their job was to promote and assist revolutionary forces in Central America, in the Middle East, in Southern Africa, and within the United States, black and brown people who, in their view, were being colonized on Indian reservations and on ghettos and in Puerto Rico. And so they saw themselves, as part of this kind of epic worldwide struggle. And as self-described, they called themselves North American anti-imperialists. They saw themselves as being in the belly of the beast. And so they were inside the United States, so they had a particular obligation to take actions that they thought would help derail this worldwide American imperialism.
And specifically, who were these women? You say that they were originally part of the Weather Underground. It was kind of a spin-off from the Weather Underground. Talk about who they were and what some of their backgrounds were.
Yeah, and their backgrounds, their stories were, I found, just so compelling and so interesting. Most had been in SDS or the Weather Underground or both. They were all basically from middle-class backgrounds. They were very intellectual, very well-educated at places like Radcliffe, Barnard, Cornell, University of Texas, Berkeley. Came from, very stable, loving homes. The idea that somehow, and I guess a lot of people understandably have this idea that terrorists are somehow deranged, or they're exhibiting, or they're the product of some hideous upbringing, just isn't true. It isn't true across the board, and it certainly isn't true with respect to May 19th. So, to take one example, Marilyn Buck, a very important member of the May 19th inner circle, She was from Austin, Texas. Her father was a veterinarian turned Episcopal priest. She went to St. Stephen's Episcopal School, private school in Austin. Had a classic upper middle class, early 1960s upbringing. Not incredible privilege, but a very comfortable life. And she, over the course of several years, became radicalized, very involved with SDS, wound up in the Bay Area, Berkeley and specifically, and she became what was described as the only white member of the Black Liberation Army. And her job, she was very intelligent, disciplined, I'd say professional revolutionary. Her job was to support the men in the BLA. She did things like, her big job was as an armorer, was buying weapons for these guys and buying ammunition. It was a lot easier for a nice, attractive Southern gal from Texas to move around without drawing a lot of attention. A lot easier for her than it was for the BLA guys, who were pretty hardcore ex-Panthers. But she made a mistake, and she bought 1,000 rounds of ammunition. She would go to different states. Outside of California, she went to Arizona, went elsewhere. She bought 1,000 rounds of ammunition with a fake ID, and that was a federal offense. She got sentenced in 1973, 10 years to a woman's federal prison in West Virginia. And in 1977, she got a furlough. And those were more innocent times. I guess federal prisoners, I doubt they get furloughs nowadays. She went to visit her parents. Okay, she came back. And then she got another furlough to visit her lawyer in New York. And so in 1977, she goes off and she doesn't return from her furlough. And she was at large for the next 8 years. So it was these kinds of stories that the biographies, the life trajectories of the women and the one or two men who were in the inner circle, that was one of the things that really drew me in. I mean, just absolutely fascinating. And I hope some of your listeners agree with it.
And talk about Judy Clark, who was another one of these fascinating characters.
Oh, absolutely. And for me, maybe the most interesting of all. So Judy, she was a classic, what was known as a red diaper baby. Her parents were both, she grew up in New York. Her parents were both high-level functionaries in the Communist Party USA. And then one day in the early 1950s, the father makes an announcement to the family, to little Judy and her mother and brother, we're moving to Moscow, where he'd been appointed the correspondent for the Daily Worker, the Communist Party USA's daily newspaper. So the family in the early 1950s, I think Stalin was actually dead at that point, moved off to Moscow. Her parents, and Judy was quite young at this point, her parents were starting to get disillusioned with communism. They'd seen the yellow-eyed, pockmarked face of Stalinism up close. And after they returned to the United States, the parents gradually, over time, moved away from the party and actually left the party. And they left the party, but Judy was bitter about their decision. She loved the party. She loved the warm embrace. I mean, the Communist Party at the time, they had summer camps, they had schools, they had musical events. She loved the warm embrace of the party, and became just very antagonistic toward her parents. And interestingly, her father, who remained a man of the left, he was involved with Dissent magazine, and anyway, he remained a democratic socialist. In 1969, she was part of a protest. They took over an administration building. The president of the University of Chicago, Edward Levy, who went on to become Attorney General under Gerald Ford, kicked her out. So Judy's father went to Irving Howe, his colleague at Dissent magazine and the great literary critic. Irving Howe, who was very close to Saul Bellow. So Saul Bellow goes to Levy and says, "Can you, give her a break? Can't you let her back in?" And Levy says, and this is a direct quotation, "No, she's a bad one." So Judy was out. Fast forward to 1981. Judy is involved in the notorious Brinks Robbery in upstate New York, October 20th, 1981. She winds up with 3 consecutive 25-year to life sentences for second-degree murder. She's locked up at the Bedford Hills Prison in Westchester. About I think it's 2016. There she is in Bedford Hills, and she's told one afternoon, "Oh, you have a visitor coming." A whole entourage shows up, and who appears but the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, and sits down with her and spends an hour with her, and decides after spending an hour with her that he's going to commute her sentence. And commutation basically meant that she was going to be eligible for possibly for parole. So she went up for parole once, and then in April of this year, and she was turned down. In April of this year, she went up for parole a second time and was freed after more than 35 years in prison. So, again, just for me, a remarkable story, and just I found just so compelling and interesting on a lot of different levels.
And talk a little bit about this plot to bomb the Capitol, how it evolved, and really what the object was, because it wasn't necessarily to kill anybody.
Right. Ostensibly, and if you read, they issued a communique after the fact. It was actually more than a plot. They did bomb the Capitol, and they caused, by one estimate, $1 million worth of damage with this one bombing. They didn't kill anyone. They said in their communique this had to do with the U.S. invasion of Grenada. They were protesting that. They signed the communique. They used a variety of different names. So when they issued these communiques after their bombings, and they called themselves the Armed Resistance Unit, but it was really this inner core of May 19th. And so the attack was spectacular, and as I said in the communique, they chose not to kill any of the senators. They said we decided to attack, and I'm paraphrasing here, the institutions of imperialism rather than killing individuals, but we reserve that right. And these senators have to understand that their blood is not sacred. So you can interpret that as bravado, or you can say, they at least considered a lethal action. The bomb went off late at night. The Senate wasn't in session, although there had been a reception earlier that evening. So, that was probably their most spectacular achievement. Interestingly, and it's sort of a dividend from their point of view, the bomb did, extensive damage, huge crater in the wall, but it also shredded a portrait of John C. Calhoun. And as some of your listeners know, John C. Calhoun had been a senator. I believe he had been vice president. He was what the great historian Richard Hofstadter called the Karl Marx of the master class. He was the theoretician of nullification, of slavery, of really white supremacy in a lot of ways, and actually he was a Yale graduate. There was a college at Yale which called Calhoun, which only recently, in the last couple of years, Yale changed the name to something else. But it was sort of an interesting little dividend for May 19th that this, portrait of this kind of diabolical figure was destroyed in the attack.
Talk a little bit about the country's reaction to the attack, how it was perceived and reported.
It got national attention. It made the evening news on then the three networks. It was covered pretty extensively, but I think ultimately it was seen as sort of a one-off thing. I think people they were, I don't want to say blasé, but it just seemed to be the work of perhaps some a couple of kooks. It wasn't seen as particularly threatening or dangerous, but it was reported, and it certainly was heavily investigated by the FBI. But there wasn't a sense of national panic or anything like that.
One of the things that becomes clear in this is that this was really pretty small potatoes compared to some of the things that were being planned and talked about.
Yeah. So the bombings at the Capitol, they bombed the Washington Navy Yard on two different occasions. They bombed at the Navy Yard. They bombed the Officers Club, and their communique basically said, and this is to paraphrase, we want these, agents of imperialism to basically realize that they are vulnerable too, that they are not totally safe. They bombed an FBI field office on Staten Island in New York. They bombed the South African consulate in New York. They bombed the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association headquarters in Lower Manhattan. So they were fairly active. But one of the things I thought about a lot is, okay, but they didn't really kill anybody. Their role in the Brinks Robbery aside, these bombings didn't kill anyone. But was that the end of the story? Well, in 1984 and in 1985, in two different places, members of May 19th were arrested. And these arrests led very quickly to the discovery of these, I don't know what to call it other than arsenals. Okay, so in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, outside of Philadelphia, in a storage locker, the police found hundreds of pounds of TNT. It was in very bad condition. It was weeping nitroglycerin, very dangerous and unstable, and also detonation cord, blasting caps, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and dozens and dozens of automatic weapons, including full automatic Uzi rifles. And similarly, in 1985, in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, another massive arsenal. Similarly, dynamite, det cord, hundreds and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, rifles, 9mm pistols, pistols with their serial numbers filed off, and thousands of blank identification cards. So Social Security cards, Drug Enforcement Agency IDs, FBI IDs. Some of the women were master printers. So you have to ask, or at least I had to ask, what was all this stuff for, right? How far were they really willing to go? I mean, we're not just talking about, to me anyway, it seems like not just symbolic bombing, but what is that arsenal for? I mean, it sounds like they were on a wartime footing, or at least they were anticipating kind of really going to war at some point. And I'd also say in the court documents that I was able to review, the National Archives, there were a lot of sort of internal documents and papers that had been recovered during these various busts. And these people were intellectuals. They spent a lot of time talking, yakking, writing position papers, and circulating them amongst themselves. And in one of these papers, it's quite chilling. One of the members is saying the time is right for what he called selective assassination, killing prosecutors, killing cops, judges, other sort of agents of imperialism. And the group, no one defected from the group. Everyone was arrested. They kept going to the bitter end in 1985. And I guess the question is, if they hadn't been stopped, how far would they have gone?
Did they have a second generation that would come along? Were there people that they were mentoring that weren't arrested in the mid-'80s?
You know, they had a, and this is according to the FBI. I was able to get thousands of pages of FBI documents released under the Freedom of Information Act, and they talked in these documents. The FBI talked about how May 19th, which had a whole series of front groups, like the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, which was an early version of Antifa, and there were probably a few hundred people in these front groups, and I don't think anyone in the front groups really understood. They didn't know about this underground apparatus and this bombing. But they talked about the FBI talked about how they used these front groups as sort of recruiting grounds, talent spotting, who seemed to be really committed and dedicated. But they didn't really bring in more people. And I think part of it was they just ultimately couldn't attract people to this campaign. I mean, even the far left in the United States at the time considered, to the extent they considered May 19th at all, considered them to be, absolute wackos. And so they didn't, and they thought about they certainly thought about trying to expand this kind of inner core, but ultimately decided against it. So they never really cultivated a next generation.
William Rosnaugh, his book about this period is The Night They Bombed the U.S. Capitol. Bill, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Jeff, it was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Schechtman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.